Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to this very special edition of a collaborative edition of the Adnan Husain Show, because in fact it's actually a co-production with Resistance is Fertile and representing the other podcast hosting today. And you can also be watching this live, not only on my stream, but also on the Resistance is Fertile live stream on YouTube. And perhaps some of you are also watching on X. And before I introduce my co-host, let me just say, please do like the stream, share it. If you can, more people will get a hold of it. If you're on X, you can just retweet this stream and people will, your followers will get it too. And of course, subscribe to both Resistance is Fertile YouTube channel and the Adnan Husain Show. But representing Resistance is Fertile, I'm really delighted to be collaborating and working again with Benji Schoendorf. Benji, welcome.
Thanks very much, Adnan, and I'm so happy that we're meeting with Radhika today. I just wanted to tell a personal story that the connection with you, Radhika, was made by my old friend Richard Barbrook, who's also a friend of yours. And Richard and I were involved in a magazine that I launched in Oxford in 1986 with one Keir Starmer as a member of the editorial board, which is a testament to my absolutely pathetic political education abilities.
Or his ability to shift shape.
Has gotten through now. So it's wonderful to have you. And I promised Richard I would thank him for making the connection.
Great.
That's wonderful. Well, I mean, as Benji has suggested, we have a very distinguished guest that we've been excited to speak with, which is Professor Radhika Desai, who is a political economist and political scientist at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. And in addition to the very important book that is sort of informing the title of our discussion today, which is Geopolitical Economy and the Ends of Capitalism, she wrote Geopolitical Economy after US Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire. But more recently is the author of Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy. And that recent book, although published with Routledge, is available for free and can be consulted. You don't have to purchase it, but it is available for free. And we suggest that you go to radhikadesai.com, where you can find more information about her other works and also how to gain access to her work, and in particular, this most recent book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. Radhika, welcome. It's wonderful to have you and to connect finally after a couple of attempts to have you for this important discussion. Thank you for joining us.
Always, I mean, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very glad to be connected to you all, to you both rather, by Richard Barbrook, who's a great friend and always a very, very unusual lateral thinker. So I always enjoy my conversations with him. And I was going to say, Benji, that the fact that Keir Starmer was a member of your editorial group is not really a sign of your politics, but really a sign of how quickly he changes politics. He probably changes politics more frequently than shirts. So
yes, sadly, and it seems like his style and quality keeps diminishing with each change. So he went from somebody who you were working with. I know some radical lawyers, who do a lot of pro bono cases for left-wing political groups, and he used to be an associate that they had worked with in the past when he was, as he still claims to be, a human rights lawyer. But yes, he's gone far from those roots. I don't know if we'll come to that much, since the UK's economy, although they'll be involved in the history that perhaps we're going to talk about today, the UK's economy doesn't make it at the sort of front and center stage of geopolitical economic developments, but we might come back to him at some point. But I wanted to start with just talking a little bit about the history of capitalism and your particular approach and understanding and take on it. You know, you framed it as geopolitical economy to take into account other factors and the experience of the global South in this history in ways that perhaps a Eurocentric or Western Marxist perspective has sometimes excluded and not developed. And in an recent interview about China, you were alluding to these other pathways towards development outside of the prism of Europe's own developmental path that has framed so much of what is considered a norm in the history of political economy and geopolitical economy. So I wanted to ask you if you might elaborate a little bit more about, in your account, what the colonial and imperial conditions that have to be taken into account, as well as the possibilities for alternate paths and possible trajectories. You know, an example you were giving was socialism with Chinese characteristics, but are there other such possible projects actually that you think are worth pointing out for the global South? So I'm wondering if maybe you could give us a little bit of sense of how you include this wider frame and what it does to our understanding of political economy when we take into this more geopolitical.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's again, it's really a whole range of different questions. So I'll try and sort of respond to them all as briefly as I can. So first of all, I would say that a geopolitical economy is simply the way Marx would have looked at international relations. So just as Marx planned to write a multi-volume work on the workings of capital. But he managed to publish only one of them in his lifetime. And then, as you know, Engels published a couple of others, although exactly how they fit into the larger plan is not, we can discuss that. So in a certain sense, he published only one book according to that plan. And one of the books, according to the plan that he was going to publish, would have been on world trade. And you see, this is so if he had written that book, I think what he would have said in it would have been very close to what I'm saying on geopolitical economy. Why is that? And that is very different from not only what mainstream bourgeois theorists say about international relations, but it is also very different from what many Marxist traditions say about international relations. And the reason for that is that, and you asked about history. So the reason for that is that Marx, various generations of Marxists, to some extent, even the second generation, the generation of Lenin and Luxemburg and so on. But certainly by the time you get to the third and further generations, basically what you get is people who are making compromises with neoclassical economics, which says that free markets and free trade are the best thing in the world. Capitalism can regulate itself spontaneously, etc., etc. And then they compromise with this. So while they continue to criticize neoclassical economics and for ignoring exploitation, most Marxists in every other way accepted neoclassical economics. So they so that moved them away from the Marxist tradition of thinking. And they essentially started saying Marx was wrong. And so if it surprises many people that there are Marxist economists in capitalist universities of the West, it shouldn't, because the overwhelming majority of them are saying Marx is wrong. What could be more useful than a political economist who says he's a Marxist, but then says Marx is wrong? So geopolitical economy goes back to the original conception of Marx, and then also builds on what Marx did manage to say about the world economy and how it functions. And and the other thing that it does is it does not agree with most Marxists that there are either no or hardly any contradictions in capitalism. I go back to Marx's original conception of capitalism as contradictory value production, and I understand it with Marx's help as riven with contradictions on every front. And I root the dynamics of international relations in the contradictions of capitalism. So you have imperialism because it is one of the ways in which ruling classes of capitalist countries, of dominant capitalist countries, can try to deal with the contradictions of capitalism. So we begin from there. And then and so what then you get is a understanding of capitalism where imperialism and the resistance to imperialism, the refusal to be dominated by imperialism, the refusal to be denied development by capitalism, becomes, these two forces become the dialectic that drives international relations forward. Now, this is completely different from the bourgeois theorists who will teach you international relations without ever mentioning the word imperialism, or doing so only to refer to some antiquated things. And Marxists, so-called Marxist international relations theorists, who are either globalists, so they say that not just that globalization is correct, but that Marx was the first theorist of globalization, which he was not, or they are some kind of US hegemony theorist, or or some kind of Gramscian, which in any case they somehow accept, anyway, they somehow accept the dominant bourgeois ways of understanding it. And geopolitical economy is very resolute in not accepting them and constructing this new ways. Now, if you understand this, then the most important contradiction is that once you have a dominant capitalist power, namely Britain as a dominant industrial power, every other country that has developed in opposition to it. Germany, the United States, Japan developed in opposition to it. And they were just in time to make it in a phase of history where their development could still be capitalist, because they could still colonize other countries.
Right.
But once they developed, and of course that development itself gave rise to the competition for colonies, which culminated in the First World War, and not only the First World War, but the entire 30 years crisis, which includes the First World War, the Second World War, the Great Depression, everything. The historian Arno Meyer called it a 30 years crisis. So then each one of these capitalisms is different. German and Japanese capitalism are very different from, and in its earlier days, US capitalism was also quite different from the liberal model of Britain. And then after 1914, 1917, basically there was no other way to develop as, to a level comparable to the advanced industrial capitalist countries other than socialism. And we've seen it twice. We've seen it in the form of the Soviet Union, and we've seen it in the form of the People's Republic of China. And so the final thing I'll say is that what all this does is it also insists, which bourgeois social science does not, that you have to look at capitalism historically. That is to say, it has a beginning, it has an end. Marx actually predicts this end very clearly when he says that, once capitalism arrives at the monopoly phase, which it had already done in the late 19th, early 20th century, it's ready for the scrap heap of history. It is ripe for socialism. He had said that, and I don't think he was wrong. And there are entirely plausible ways of explaining the trajectory of history since. But so looking at capitalism historically is something that the bourgeois social sciences don't do, and the so-called Marxist versions of these social sciences also don't do. And there's a very simple reason, because if you look at things historically, then capitalism has a beginning and an end, and the bourgeois social sciences will never acknowledge that it has an end. So,
but I guess one question that I would have as a follow-up is, why don't Marxist thinkers typically, who are of course trained in the very idea that Marx was foreseeing and analyzing the contradictions within capitalism that would lead to its implosion, collapse, and transformation into some other mode of production when it achieved this level of monopoly capitalism. And he is, of course, thinking, or at least the rhetoric around his discussion of it makes it seem as if that time is not far off, because he can recognize already in the way in which industrial capitalism has been developing in Europe, it has taken on certain features. But obviously, it didn't quite end the way it may have been expected. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to call this episode The Ends of Capitalism as well, is thinking about the later stages, which we all people always locate themselves when there's an arc of history in its sort of later, the value heuristically of having that kind of a narrative of beginning and end is usually thinking of oneself in near the end of one thing or in the beginning of another, right? That's kind of how analytically it's useful to create these historical narratives. So we might think of ourselves here at the end of late capitalism, whatever that might mean. Some have argued, that we're actually not in capitalism. I'm thinking of Yanis Varoufakis, and I'm sure you've come across this kind of argument where, we're in techno-feudalism, and as a medieval historian, the invocation of the rent, kind of seeking class, the kind of control that you have, in some ways it was kind of compelling to think of, like, could we be returning to a kind of feudal structure? But so I guess that's my real question here is, what changes in your approach and analysis to both say that it's still very much within the Marxist tradition, and yet it has to explain that transformations took place and it didn't end the way it might have been foreseen. And of course, some of this must have to do with colonialism and what you're saying in terms of imperialism. And those categories themselves are sometimes, I think, not well kind of understood of how they relate to the geopolitical economy. And so I'm wondering if maybe in your kind of attempt to answer, what's happened, you could also help us understand a little bit more of the difference between a system of political arrangement, of subjecting others to your sovereignty through conquest, maybe even the particulars of settler colonialism within that kind of system. And I just had a very interesting conversation with Max Ale on Friday about his concern with the model of settler colonialism not taking into account kind of imperialism as the kind of surrounding kind of condition, but also what is in a post-colonial sort of world. People have invented kind of the concept of neocolonialism. Is that the same thing as imperialism? How do you understand what imperialism is after the colonial era comes to an end?
Okay, so this is also, again, another very fine set of questions. And I see at least 4 different questions. So I'll answer them in turn. And then if there's anything left, then please do a follow-up. Okay, so the first is techno-feudalism. Has capitalism changed into something else? So I would say, first of all, that to see the present phase of capitalism as no longer capitalism, but something different, lets capitalism off the hook. I'm sorry to say, but in late monopoly capitalism, this is what capitalism looks like. I actually have a short paper which should be coming out in the European Journal of the History of Ideas very soon in a special issue, precisely on this issue of at least of neo-feudalism anyway. Are we living in some variety of feudalism, techno or not? And of course, it all hinges on precisely the category that you mentioned, Adnan, which is rent. So my answer is, first of all, that when you get to the monopoly phase of capitalism, then yes, there is a lot of unearned income, because as a monopolist, you can get away. You can suppress competition, you can use political power to do that, and so on. Plus, of course, in the monopoly phase, as monopoly capital uses its privileges, inadvertently, it manages to suppress the conditions of its own existence. So, for example, what we have seen over the last 50 odd years of neoliberalism, or, 45 plus years of neoliberalism, is that rather than solving the problem of the finitude of demand, the fact that demand, part of the reason you got the crisis of the 1970s was that demand worldwide had been saturated. Rather than solving that problem, it has exacerbated that problem by the attack on the working class, by the reduction of wages, etc., and the attack on the third world. So, and of course, once capitalism starts doing that, then productive investment does not make sense, and you get the progressive financialization of capitalism. So interest and rent as two forms of unearned profit or unearned income become very normal and come to dominate increasingly. But, and here's the so my point is, this is what monopoly capitalism looks like when you let it do what it likes, which is what neoliberalism has been about. Now, rent is not a feudal category.
No.
Tribute is a feudal category.
Yes.
Rent is a specifically capitalist category. And I actually show in that paper, based on the work of Mark Bloch's celebrated work on feudalism, that rent began to make increasingly an appearance precisely as feudalism was declining and capitalism was rising. And tribute was gradually turned into, first of all, cash tribute, and then eventually rent. And that the payment of rent involved a increase in the power of the tenant, or the serf became a tenant, the serf paying tribute became a tenant paying rent, and then you got, but rent is a capitalist category, and that is what you get in capitalism. So rent is no reason, nor is interest any reason for calling the current system feudal. In fact, it is totally capitalist. Now, so that's my answer to the first question about techno-feudalism. The second question is, if Marx was right.
Can I pause you
Yeah,
right just there as another component of that before you go on to the second aspect you wanted to discuss? Is one of the arguments I think that has been made that you might also object to has been that, well, when you go on to these kind of platforms like Amazon Marketplace, this isn't really a market. But of course, that kind of values the characterization of the market as what capitalism is. So why would that, even if it wasn't a market? I mean, there were markets before, and there may be no markets later, but that isn't actually the real definitional kind of characteristic of capitalism as a mode of production. So I'm just wondering if that's also part of your analysis.
Sure. I mean, markets were always jigged. I mean, Adam Smith says famously, he says that, funnily enough, he's defending the rights of workers to organize, because the people, people in his time were criticizing that workers should not combine, workers should not conspire against employers. And he said, you put 2 or 3 employers in any one place, and no sooner do they get together than they start conspiring. So markets have always been rigged. So the fact that you have markets where information is unevenly distributed, power is unevenly distributed, what is the labor market but an extremely unequal form of power? So again, you're absolutely right that to say that, Amazon is not a market. And plus, I should add one other thing, neoclassical economics, which unfortunately too many Marxist economists also follow, most Marxist economists also follow, claims to have, its pride of its most proudest achievement is supposed to be its theory of prices, that, markets, is like a permanent auction in which prices are discovered and blah, blah. This is completely wrong. They do not have a theory of prices that really works. There is no ongoing auction where if you and I want to start producing anything like ballpoint pens, the ballpoint pen already has a price. And in my production decisions, I have to make my decisions around that. I mean, the price may change, but for any given producer, a price is given. And when you go to the market and you say, you see tomatoes are, I don't know, $15 a kilo or whatever, and you're going to say, what? They're not worth it, because what is the going price of tomatoes, which is implicitly, how much work does it take to produce tomatoes in current conditions, at current levels of productivity, current conventions about intensity of work, current wages of workers, etc. Somehow implicitly we know this. But anyway, so what I'm saying is that neoclassical economics, by the way, is a total hoax. And this is where most of our ideas unfortunately come from. And it's a hoax, by the way, very simply because it was born precisely when capitalism was becoming monopoly capitalism. And it still rested all its justifications of capitalism on the notion of competitive markets.
Which is just ideological debunk really. And then you have people going, oh, well, it's not a market because it doesn't fit the ideological definition, when in fact it is what a market concretely is, which
Exactly.
is this, rigged system.
Yeah.
But I derailed you from some of the other points you were going
Yeah,
to
sure.
ask about.
So so the second question I took you to ask me is that if it's the case that, I mean, if Marx predicted that capitalism, once it entered this monopoly phase, would have exhausted his historical mission, such as it was. I mean, that it was going to develop the forces of production, albeit it would do so brutally, chaotically, etc. But it would develop the forces of production. But by this time, it would no longer do so, and therefore it was ripe for socialism. And people would also see that the fact that a handful of corporations own the whole economy simply means that a small number of private individuals are benefiting from what is clearly social labor, because you can see the socialization of labor. Thousands of workers going to work in, millions even of or hundreds of thousands of workers going into work in one factory or one company or what have you. So people would see this, but this did not happen. So how do we explain that? So the first thing I would say is that obviously you did actually get a huge catastrophe, out of which you did get the first revolution against capital. And I take the Bolshevik Revolution very seriously as a revolution against capital. And one of the papers I'm currently writing is also trying to show that actually, people say, well, that was a kind of mistake or whatever, because Marx expected that capitalism revolution would take place first in the most developed country in the world. But even in Marx's time, that was not true, because Marx was basically saying that revolution would first take place in Germany. Why? Because German capitalism may be backward, but the German proletariat, the legatee of the philosophy of Hegel and what have you, was much more able to understand this, kind of system, and would revolt against it and so on. So anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is that you got the first socialist revolution, and in the rest of the world, revolution did not occur, although it was attempted. I mean, throughout Europe and even in North America. I mean, I live in Winnipeg, and in Winnipeg, we had the 1919 general strike, which was quite an event for the time. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is you did get a revolutionary conflagration, which was, however, suppressed. And we have been living in an age of the contest between capitalist counter-revolution and socialist revolution ever since. And by the way, I should also add to this that, around the end of the Second World War, there were progressive intellectuals in the West, people like even John Maynard Keynes, who was not unsympathetic to socialism, or to communism in his time. He did respect it. Or Karl Polanyi and many others. They all expected that when the war ended, the whole world would turn decisively to the left. Now, in our own time, like today, most scholars would say, including people who call themselves Marxist economists, that look at, nothing happened. In fact, you got the golden age of capitalism, you got the golden age of growth, and it shows that capitalism was capable of reinventing itself, blah, blah, etc. Actually, this is also not true, because golden age growth was not due to capitalism. It was due, number one, to the heavy modification of capitalism in first world countries in ways that Eric Hobsbawm says, would have previously been rejected as socialist, Keynesian welfare states. Number two, you had socialist countries which actually grew very robustly. And economists in the West used to be envious of the ability of the Soviet Union to continue growing consistently without ups and downs of capitalist business cycles, because they didn't have business cycles. They could plan, they're going to invest so much, they're going to grow so much. It was all very simple. And of course, third world countries had their best time so far, because they were engaged in projects of national autonomous development, which were distinctly left-leaning. They were not capitalist forms of growth. So this is what gave us the golden age. It was the socialism rather than the capitalism. And this is further proved by the fact that once you start rolling back these socialistic reforms, as you did under neoliberalism, which was the chosen answer to the stagnation of the 70s. The stagnation of the 70s was caused because the underlying system remained capitalist. The better cure would have been to deepen the socialistic reforms, but this was rejected. We have for 45 years been giving capital senile monopoly capital ever greater freedoms. And what has it produced? Low growth, low investment, high financialization, high rentierism, high inequality. And it is making things like making Western societies unlivable. So, and today, therefore, I would say that actually we are living through the decline of capitalism. I think that the wars we are witnessing, etc., all of these are, and the manifest lack of democracy within the capitalist first world countries, all of these things are happening as you know, they are the domestic and international manifestations of the demise of capitalism and the struggle by their elites to keep it going. So this is the situation we're living in. And the final question was, you said, how is neocolonialism different from imperialism? Basically, imperialism is a wider system than just colonialism. Even that at that time, this was recognized. So, for example, Lenin distinguishes, and other people distinguish, between colonies and semi-colonies, formal colonies and informal colonies, and so on. People recognize that what the United States was doing in the Western Hemisphere, which had nominally independent states, was also a form of imperialism. So imperialism is a larger system which does not necessarily end with the end of colonialism. So it continues. But you see, one of the problems is that various Marxists or various thinkers who call themselves Marxists compete with one another to show how radical they are by saying that, oh, the strength of imperialism has only increased. No. The strength of imperialism has been decreasing since 1914. It has been declining since 1914, not as fast as you and I would like, not as fast as the world needs, but it has been declining. And we are living now through a phase of its further accelerated decline, to the point where because if you don't have imperialism, you can't have capitalism. So the longevity of capitalism is now being placed in doubt. So that's my answer to your last question. Yeah.
So I have a few questions following up from this. One is starting from this growth that we had, post World War II, which was very much based on using socialist planning, and this idea that you put in your geopolitical economy, that there is something very specific about the US empire, is that it's not an empire, in the sense that, the British Empire was the last empire, and the US empire doesn't actually rule the world in the way that the British Empire did. And so it looks to me as though, when we think about this empire, it's always been a kind of would-be empire. And maybe the one strategy that was open to it was a strategy of chaos, rather than colonize the nations. It just went to basically break all sorts of socialist movements, all sorts of planification, and all sorts of coexistence, to go for this very rapacious, chaos strategy, where you just break up countries and even make a commodity out of destruction and genocide. So how do you see that?
Sure. So first of all, the point you're making is that in geopolitical economy, I point out that the United States, the United States is not an empire. I mean, let me take a couple of steps back. I mean, the argument, the best way of putting it, is that it revolves around the term hegemony, which is, of course, more recently, people have been unabashedly using empire. Even the advocates of US empire have been saying we are an empire, and so, etc., etc. But back in the 70s, Charles Kindleberger came up with this idea of leadership in the international system, and which some people also then use the word hegemony for. So this hegemony leadership is basically what I argue is that, contrary, some people say that the US is still hegemonic, which is, there are fewer and fewer such people. Other people say that the US was once hegemonic and it is now declining. But I argue that the US was never hegemonic. So, and my argument is that, originally, actually, I believed in the idea of hegemony. I thought that, in fact, I was going to use the idea of US hegemony to criticize the notion of globalization. But then, as I tried to operationalize the notion of hegemony, I realized that this does not make sense. I mean, there are as many definitions, if not more, of hegemony as there are writers on the subject. So everybody makes up their own definition of hegemony. And then it becomes, and they also keep changing their definitions. So it's like trying to, catch hold of a slippery eel. I mean, you can't really catch hold of it. So I then did a lot of historical research on where this idea may have come from. And what I realized is that actually in the early 20th century, certainly by the eve of the First World War, US elites were very conscious that British power was declining. They had, of course, the whole development of the United States was in many ways pitted against British domination. So they were very conscious of it. And so they decided that they were going to take up the baton, so to speak, they were going to perform the role in the world that Britain was no longer capable of performing. The difficulty with this notion was severalfold. So number one, Britain, the first industrial capitalist country in the world, was bound to dominate the world market for some time. But eventually, as soon as competitors emerged, its domination would end. The US was one of those competitors. So, of course, already by the time these other powers emerged, the 1870s, 1880s, the world has already become multipolar. It is no longer possible for one power to dominate in that way. So that's one reason. The second reason is that the United States said, oh, well, we know that we can never acquire an empire to match the British Empire, the great British Empire on which the sun never set, etc. So they said, well, that's okay. We'll settle for making the dollar the world's money. They had just created the Federal Reserve, etc. So the dollar was going to be the world's money. The difficulty with this was that, of course, the pound was never a national currency. It was an imperial currency. The only way in which it operated was that Britain could extract tribute from its non-settler, non-white colonies and export it as capital to Europe and its settler colonies. And there is such an intense racial element to this as well, is that it's absolutely fascinating. But therefore, it is not surprising that, the United States, of course, was a sinkhole for this sort of British capital. But all these parts of the world, continental Europe, North America, Australia, etc., the late 19th to the early 20th century was the period of their rapid industrialization due to this extraction of capital from one part of the world and pouring it into another part of the world. So sterling had served as world money by exporting capital. America had no capital to export. It always provided the world with liquidity by running deficits. Robert Triffin pointed out the problem with this, the bigger your deficits, the less valuable your dollar. And in many ways, this contradiction still works. And my argument is that since 1971, when the gold link was broken, the dollar's value has essentially relied on massively expanding purely financial demand for the dollar. Essentially, the United States has opened a casino and has invited the world to pour their money into it. But now even that casino is not getting all the money that it should. So you have the Federal Reserve essentially, stepping up to buoy up asset markets and so on. We can talk about that. But so the US was never hegemonic. And I don't elaborate the military. I do talk about the military aspect, but militarily, the United States has never won a single war. It had to compromise in Korea. It lost in Vietnam. And since then, all we've seen is a string of compromises. And I think what you said earlier, Benji, was very true, that, it is able to sow chaos all over the world, but it is unable to construct an imperial order which benefits itself, which is stable imperial that benefits itself. So I think that it is careening towards collapse.
So whereas previous empires would divide and rule, this one seems to be just dividing and running around creating this chaos and just, extracting what it can in this increasingly anarchic way, I guess. And on the other side, you have the rising power of China, which has actually taken away, economic supremacy from the US. I think Russia, clearly, China possibly, and even Iran have taken away military supremacy from the US. And I would say the genocide has taken away moral supremacy from the West.
Absolutely. Yes.
And one idea I'm interested in your views on is this idea that because, as you rightly analyzed and showed, the US was never a real empire and was always kind of a pretend empire. It doesn't actually rule things. That meant that from the beginning, it was extremely invested in the narrative side of it. That's more psychological, but it has to present itself as the ruler of the world precisely because it doesn't. So with this comes a lot of, psychological formations, such as collective narcissism, such as an increase in the racism, in the supremacism, and in the just, overall producing bullshit to fight wars on narrative battlefields. So I wonder how you see that, in terms of this broad geopolitical economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's odd, but, at the end of the Second World War, there was a definite sense in which the United States seemed like a colossus, that dominated the world. Not because the United States was itself a colossus, although it had acquired some of those elements simply by being the productive economy that supplied the warring European powers. If the United States had not existed, as one of you said that you talk about Max Isle and settler colonialism and so on. I mean, I often wonder what would have happened if the US simply didn't exist. The European powers in both wars, and I wonder whether there would have been a second one, would have exhausted themselves very quickly. But the fact that the United States existed to keep supplying them with more arms and make piles of money out of it. This is the key. The US has historically benefited enormously from war. So anyway, in 1945, the United States has doubled the size of its economy. The rest in the years of the war, 39 to 45, US economy doubles in size. The other economies are destroyed. So very briefly, it looks like a colossus bestriding the world. But that position disappears very quickly. By early 70s, it is gone from 50% to a quarter of GDP. And since then, I would say, anyway, we can discuss GDP another time. So the one thing is, but the funny thing is that, the word hegemony does not come into existence at the height of US power. The idea of US hegemony does not. It becomes explicitly voiced in the 70s when the United States is losing the war in Vietnam. The dollar has come off gold. The whole economy is spinning out of control, et cetera, et cetera. So funnily enough, as you rightly say, the element of discourse, the element of propaganda is very much part of this story. And I think that all you have to do is just lift the propaganda curtain a little bit, and a very different reality manifests itself. And you see, this is also quite interesting from another point of view. I maintain that if you look at just the same time as the hegemony stability theory was born, Kindleberger's ideas, so was born international political economy. Now, you might think that international political economy, like any other field of study, whether it is economics or sociology or whatever, is a kind of worldwide discipline, but it isn't. It's basically like the American Baseball World Series. They call it the World Series, but apart from one or two Caribbean countries, there is only the Americans playing in it. So the thing is that IPE is totally dominated by Americans, and they have an enormous industry of people whose function is to talk up American power, to talk up the dollar system, to talk up American military power. And they are, I mean, to this day, they are doing it, and they're lying through their teeth. When we know that, for example, the Americans, just let's take a very simple example. The dollar system may seem extremely, esoteric, but let's just take military power. The Chinese, the Russians, even the North Koreans have hypersonic missiles. The Americans, who spend $1 trillion a year on their military, more than anybody else, more than the rest of them combined, don't have this, because they don't have a defense industry. They have a military industrial complex, which is coddled, which is used to getting state subsidies for doing nothing. And that's what you get. That's why the Americans have never won a war. Why should they? When the purpose is never to win wars, the purpose is just to have some people make money. You know?
And that's at the end of the day one of the deathly contradictions of this system. And this is something also Michael Hudson talks a lot about. This financial capitalism is kind of eating itself at the end of the day, because it financializes everything, deindustrializes, and is unable to reindustrialize, not with tariffs or anything. And as there's combined and uneven development, as you say in your work. Well, the rest of the world is developing and is going to emerge as a material alternative no matter what happens. So I truly think that we are seeing the last throes of this particular would-be empire.
No, exactly. I think that Keynes says somewhere that some bubbles on a stream, some bubbles of speculation on a stream of enterprise does no harm. But when the entire stream becomes, about speculation, then you've got a real problem. I mean, it's a bit like the financial economy. I mean, there's a very good, simple English way of putting it. The financial sector, the rentier sectors, they are takers. The productive sector are the makers. Now, if the size of the taking sector keeps growing in relation to the size of the making sector, and the taking can only be done, you can only take from the makers. You can take from households, you can take from governments, and you can take from productive enterprises. So these are the three sources, and all of these three are heavily indebted today, which means that a substantial part of their income must go to pay those who do nothing, those who only take. So these are the sort of, the suction tubes that the octopus of financialization has in each productive enterprise, each productive unit, and they keep sucking value out. And this is, Trump says he's going to reindustrialize America, reindustrialize my foot. He is using the rhetoric of reindustrialization to continue his cutting of taxes for precisely those who are making nothing, who are simply taking. And so this is, and you are right, this is only, and funnily enough, what you've come to now is a more blatant form of taking than ever before. That's where we are at, because it can no longer be hidden.
Right.
Well, this is so fascinating, because usually I would think you're suggesting that already by the 70s, it's very clear and evident, and that's where this ideology of expatiating upon and inflating American hegemony as a discourse, maybe in the culture as well, like Hollywood, getting back to Benji's point that a lot of it is about this kind of psychological warfare and the narrative and the disinformation, as part of this kind of promotion. Of course, we would just, remember that, during that whole period, of course, how could the US truly be a total hegemon when it was contested by, the Soviet Union and all of that? I mean, it was a bipolar world, of course. At least. And then even, I guess maybe this is the interesting question then, is in your thesis and your analysis, once the Soviet Union, breaks apart, and you no longer have a kind of geopolitical economic kind of counterweight or block against the Western capitalist system, with the U.S. as the chief, representative of it. And when there is supposedly this victory of the U.S. model, at least the way, again, it's sort of trumpeted and declared in the 1990s in the so-called era of globalization, how would you kind of characterize what shifts and changes in that context? For my mind, the empire talk began much more obviously, in the era of global war on terror, where even somebody like Michael Ignatieff. Okay, so for us in Canadians, we're all Canadians here. Failed prime minister, but I thought he was never going to be amount to much, because in 2004 he writes like this article in New York Times Magazine declaring that we, meaning the Americans at that point, may have to embrace empire. Kind of picking up on some of that kind of like political hyperventilating of historians like what's his name, Neil, the guy who
Ferguson.
Ferguson.
Yeah, Neil Ferguson, exactly.
Yeah.
Kind of repackaging that as like, well, maybe the U.S. in this era, and I say this as a human rights, may have to embrace, empire. But at the time he's announcing it, it's like so clear that this is actually the decline of any kind of U.S. power and hegemony, and that it's attempting to extend it through these other mechanisms. So I'm wondering what you think about that period, and how would, since your book was about it, maybe kind of take us through a little bit the reframing of that before we talk a little bit about the contemporary conditions. What happened then?
Yeah. So, it's interesting, hegemony, stability theory in the work of Kindleberger and then a few other people. And unfortunately, wonderful scholars like Emmanuel Wallerstein and Giovanni Arrighi also ended up giving a lot of credence to these ideas, but we'll park that for now. I think they were wrong. And Arrighi, in his last writings, even says that the United States was never hegemonic, but then he doesn't reflect on how this reflects on his previous work, but we'll leave that aside. Basically, these ideas were announced in the 70s, but they were never fully accepted. So, you get, Reagan is elected in an election in which his opponent Carter is saying maybe we should settle down to a more modest role in the world, and then Reagan wins by vilifying this kind of attitude. And then Reagan still engages in talks with Gorbachev. This idea that the United States brought down the Soviet Union is very problematic for me. I think the Soviet Union came down for its own reasons, which we can discuss separately. But it had nothing to do with the United States bringing it down in any way whatsoever, either by by doing better economically or by militarily, the Afghanistan, etc. I think none of these things work for me. But nevertheless, Reagan is still making terms with the Soviet Union. But then once the Soviet Union collapses for its own reasons, then you sort of begin to get this idea that first the idea slowly emerges of unipolarity. But this unipolarity idea is still connected with the idea of globalization. In the 1990s, it was not empire, but globalization that was like the buzzword. And you couldn't think everywhere you looked, there was globalization. And I think that, Joe Stiglitz, and I narrate this in Geopolitical Economy, Joe Stiglitz had become the chairman of Clinton's Council of Advisors. And if you read the report, I think it was the 97 economic report of the president, which the Council of Advisors churns out every year, it is remarkable. I mean, this guy today poses as this great progressive, thinker and so on. In it, he is justifying the use of sanctions to enforce globalization around the world, justifying the lifting of capital controls, etc., etc. So he is basically doing the total neoliberal thing. Anyway, so you get that. And then, funnily enough, with the George Bush Jr. administration, and apparently George Bush Jr. didn't like the term globalization, because it was too multilateral for him, and he decided that he would, the project for the new American century, which is about projecting American power, is backing George Bush Jr. It was also determining what happened in the last years of the Clinton presidency, because remember, it was formed in 97, so it's already influencing things, and so you begin to get the use of the term empire. But as you say, by the middle of that first decade of the 21st century, the Americans were in the Iraqi quagmire, and etc., etc. 2 or 3 years later, you got 2008, what I call the North Atlantic financial crisis. There was nothing global about it. It was very localized in the North Atlantic region. But again, we'll park that for now. So what happened? Essentially, the end of the Soviet Union, the demise of the Soviet Union, was interpreted as a victory of the West. No, it was merely the collapse of the West's opponent for its own reasons, at a time when the West had already embarked on the path to the unraveling of its own power, namely neoliberalism. So neoliberalism was already undermining, financializing the economy. You already had the various financial crises around the world, culminating in the East Asian financial crisis in the 90s. Then you got the dot-com bubble, then you got the housing and credit bubble. So all of these things were already happening. So if you think about it, at that moment in time, in the early 90s, there were two major expectations. One is that the world would become unipolar and the United States would benignly exercise its hegemony over the world and everything would be wonderful and so on. The second expectation was that everybody would enjoy a peace dividend. The world would enjoy a peace dividend. But instead, within less than 2 decades later, we were talking about multipolarity. And the United States had already been engaged in war after fruitless war, violent, destructive war after fruitless war, of which the current ongoing genocide in Gaza, they are just a part of that. They're trying to do everything possible to hang on to their power, which they know is slipping from there. And so it is increasingly desperate, their effort to hang on to that power.
So I have a follow-up on this, and it's kind of a theoretical question for a Marxist such as you and us. And this notion of hegemony is, funnily enough, it's kind of very much picked up even consciously by the right from Gramsci, who himself kind of borrowed it from Lenin. But this idea that you have to have some kind of common sense of the time to have domination of a society, and it's not just your material interests and domination, but your perspective, which is kind of a long historical perspective on capitalism, really shows the material contradictions and the material weakness of this empire, which seems to be at the moment kind of running on ideological fumes. And yet it's still running. We are there as Marx is predicting its final demise, but it's always somewhere in the future. And how do you account for the fact that it has managed to survive for so long on narrative, on ideology? It's almost like, theoretical questions for Marxists, because it's almost like the ideas are keeping this empire together, where the actual material reality should have brought it down already. So how do you see this one? And I think it relates also to our notions of hegemony and Gramsci somehow, and somebody was asking in the chat. So take this where you want to.
I think, again, there are many questions here, so I'll try and answer as many as I can, or all that I
answer
can.
The ones you want to answer.
Okay, great. So on the idea of hegemony, it's very interesting. You're right that Gramsci takes the idea from Lenin, but Gramsci takes the idea, and I would say he does something a little bit illegitimate with it, because Lenin used the idea of hegemony to refer to the relationship between what we may call compatible social classes. So the working class and the peasantry. The working class would exercise hegemony over the peasantry. Gramsci then takes this idea and uses it to try to understand the relationship between antagonistic classes, namely capitalists and workers, right? And it does not work. So to me, so this idea that somehow, you see, in a certain sense, and I'm not sure how conscious Gramsci was about doing this. I mean, undoubtedly, there are ways in which domination is always laced with certain types of rhetoric and discourse and so on, but it is usually experienced as domination. The rhetoric doesn't work except perhaps for some maybe bystanders or something. For example, a patriarch is not going to say to the woman, I want to make you suffer, I want to leave you uneducated, I want to deprive you of medical care, and I want you to keep having kids. No, they will say, my dear, it is very good for you, it is you will be in tune with your nature if you stay at home and have lots of kids and look after everybody and so on, and cook and clean and blah blah and so on. Now, so obviously there's always a discourse, but so to me, this use of the term hegemony is always problematic. And I think that the power, whether class power or national power, international power, imperial power, has always been resisted. And that's why you have, I'm much more, so this idea that somehow if you lace your domination with a little bit of nice rhetoric, that you can keep it going for a long time or forever, this is a form of domination worship. Actually, domination does not work. I'm a Hegelian in that way. The master-slave relationship is a dialectic in which there is always, it's not going to end well for the master, basically. And so in that sense, I would say, so that's one part, the theoretical part of it. Now, you're saying, how come the United States has kept it going? What I'm saying is that the rhetoric, you see, the Vietnamese know they defeated the Americans, but the rest of the world somehow kept celebrating. And remember, they started celebrating US power, particularly in the 1990s. Especially with the stock market bubble. And then you got George Bush Jr., and that didn't last long. So that, again, after the 2008, there was a problem again. So there's a very narrow window during which people thought of American power as supreme, etc. As late as 1988, Paul Kennedy was writing a book called Rise and Fall of Great Powers, in which, the United States was only the latest to fall, etc., etc. So in that sense, through military overreach, and he didn't even get to the underlying economic problems. So I would say that today the United States is, its power does not extend very far. It just look at it. I mean, it is dying to attack Iran. It has just attacked Iran. It has not succeeded in doing what it wanted to do. That is a limit. And let me, maybe, since we began this with talking about China, let me bring things to China. The United States made nice with China. Originally, as you know, of course, to drive a wedge between the China and the Soviet Union. But, China also took its opportunities where it got them. And, sort of, what is it? Build your power, hide your light, whatever it was, that's what they did for a long time. But also, the thing is that the United States made nice with China because the United States assumed that China would forever remain the manufacturer of cheap products. Cheap, low-tech goods, your toys, your shoes, your T-shirts, etc. Of course, unbeknownst to the American leadership, the Chinese leadership had no intention of remaining there. And it has used all the strengths of a socialist system, which it is, to plan to acquire ever greater productive and technological capacities, to the extent that today China is a major technological competitor to the United States. And to me, that shows that, we already talked about defense technology, where the US is woefully behind. But look at what DeepSeek did earlier this year. It exposed the complete bankruptcy of the US model of innovation, the very model of innovation which we are told by the Schumpeterians of this world is like absolutely fantastic. You need free markets and freedom and to get innovation and blah, blah, and so on. And again, I have a paper coming out about this, and which is basically entitled "How DeepSeek Has Upended the United States Sci-Fin-Fi Model." You all heard of sci-fi. So sci-fi is all science fiction. We had a science fiction bubble before in the 1990s. We have another one today. And in both of these, finance was always involved.
Yeah.
And the US has a history of doing this, of essentially inflating expectations of naive investors, perhaps, and not so naive investors, by making extraordinary claims about what can be achieved by this technology, claims that do not need to be made to advance that technology. And in fact, if I'm reading the news in places like the Financial Times correctly, it's also sending people off in the wrong direction. Meta has had to close a lot of its AI facilities, or farm them out, because trying to achieve human intelligence is not going to be possible. Well, whoever told you it would be possible? Why not try to achieve a more finite result, which is what DeepSeek did, and it did very well out of that. Anyway, make a long story short, I think that the US power is far more undermined. It's perhaps we who are captive of a very specific American discourse, but the rest of the world is not, and it's going its own merry way. China is going its own merry way. Iran is going its own merry way. Venezuela, North Korea. Think about it. All these countries that you never imagined would, the Soviet Union could fall, but the Soviet Union did not fall to capitalism. Soviet Union fell to some of its own limitations, and I would say also circumstantially, a small section of the elite that had lost faith in socialism temporarily got control over the state system and essentially dissolved the Soviet Union, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Yes, fascinating. I mean, one thing that you mentioned that just because I'm a historian, so I always like to talk about the past, but just something you mentioned about, the U.S. wars subsequent to that, period. It's really all of a piece in continuing. And I think maybe speaking of the Gulf War, to make sure that Iraq would have to withdraw from Kuwait, etc. But, it made me think that actually the two sets of wars we've been dealing with the last several years actually both come out of that moment as well. One of which, of course, was the extension in order to continue the U.S. military industrial complex and the sale of weapons globally as almost the chief industry. So the extension of NATO, after the end of the Warsaw Pact, and of course the Ukraine war that we have been witnessing, obviously just a byproduct of the geopolitical and economic kind of conditions of, instead of giving us a peace dividend, they went a different way. Instead of creating a kind of livable, sustainable world, which we could have had for decades now, if not even, longer, that these wars, both in the Middle East or West Asia and Eastern Europe, really do come out of that kind of moment in the policies and the decisions there that, but what I wanted to come to is actually something you were really discussing here when you're talking about China and China's and many other countries going their own path and their own direction. I just recently did an episode looking back on the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, and thinking about a little bit about why it's still important to pay attention to it and its legacies, but also what are the differences and limitations, in the geopolitical situation and geopolitical economic situation today, and observing that while there was a political project then, which was really about anti-colonialism and protecting gains of sovereignty for new nations in 1955 that had emerged out of direct colonial control, they didn't necessarily have a plan. They knew that they had faced really big challenges for development, and that's what they wanted. They wanted peace, they wanted sovereignty so that they could develop their own societies and also create lines of possible affiliation outside of being forced into military blocks to actually have South-South type of cooperation that wouldn't be having to be recircuited through the first world or the second world, although many of them were perhaps more open to the socialist model, as you were pointing out during this period. And the countries that made the biggest gains really did adopt something like what we would consider in an earlier era the socialist model. And so I was wondering if maybe you might tell us a little bit about the contemporary situation. A lot of hopes have been put on BRICS, and I would say that the difference is that there is an economic kind of power and sets of models, attempting to do a development bank that would, compete and actually short circuit the reliance on the IMF and so on. And these things have been talked about and announced. But there seems to be much less of a political project, which is a big difference from Bandung, where there was some kind of, despite all their difference, there was some sort of collective political project protecting sovereignty, anti-colonialism, a third, kind of block within the UN. And so I'm wondering what you think about what's happening geopolitically with BRICS. Are sort of, for example, these recent discussions between India and China and their leadership significant, perhaps, in reviving the possibility? Because I would say up to this point, I've looked at Brazil and India as among two of the major BRICS nations that may have been really out of step with some kind of political imagination for a future order, that could be built by hanging on to some aspects of dependence in the US Western system. What, is your analysis of these changes and the possibilities and prospects for, a different arrangement in the world?
Yeah, sure. So I think that perhaps I should best begin with making a very fundamental point, and then that will throw light on how we should think about the BRICS, because the situation is very complex, and I agree with what you said about Brazil and India. But let me begin by reminding you that, I pointed out earlier, and we all agreed that after 1914, you got, it was not an accident that the first socialist revolution occurred after this point. As Lenin said, the world had already been divided up. Now there could only be wars of redivision. The two wars were wars of redivision. But in that context, if any country wanted to develop now, it would have to do it on a socialist basis, no longer on a capitalist basis, because capitalism would require imperialism, and that was not possible. So now that means that the new types of development that must now take place of the rest of the world, if the rest of the world is to develop, it has to do so in three ways that are completely different from the way the first world developed. First, it has to develop, this country will have to develop not from a kind of point zero of lack of development, but from a point set back, where imperialism has set it back. And so you're no longer at a starting line, but sort of way behind the starting line. And so you have to begin, and you have to recover even what was lost. Number two, you have to do it without the luxury of imperialism. You cannot make some other part of the world pay for your development, as imperialism allowed the first world to do. And number three, you have to do it in the face of unremitting imperialist resistance. Yeah. And all of these three things remain as true today as they were at any point since 1914. And that's why, and that's why the two most successful models of development have been socialist. They were the only two models that have brought their respective populations at some level of development roughly comparable to first world countries. Not exactly, but the first world countries are imperialist anyway. So I think that to imagine that development must be the imitation of these imperialist lifestyles is well, quite frankly, it would be quite destructive of the environment, to say nothing else. But it's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. And besides, I don't think we necessarily want that. We don't want that kind of model of development. I think that the development of today's third world should be much more publicly oriented. For example, why have a multiplication of private vehicles when you can have excellent public transportation systems, for example? But anyway, so just to so once you say that, then of course, Bandung makes sense. Bandung was, of course, the idea of the third world was, we are not capitalists and not communists, but in reality, the conceptions of development always lean distinctively leftwards. They had support from the Soviet Union and other socialist countries and so on. Indeed, the Soviet Union and China often competed with one another for the allegiance of various third world countries. So all of this makes sense. Bandung makes sense. And then you had the sort of long night of the neoliberal economic retardation of the third world of the 80s and 90s. But in the new century, you had a very different reality where there were a number of countries that were growing fast for a number of reasons. There were also benign reasons. Think about it. You pointed out that Brazil and India are sort of don't quite fit. But in those years, in the early years of the 21st century, both had progressive governments. And these progressive governments were able to create, to some extent, to a limited extent, the conditions for decent growth. Brazil, even for a short, I don't know what the situation is right now, but, even made it sort of, alleviated the situation of being of being the most unequal country in the world, etc. So, all of these things were good. But of course, in the BRICS countries, you said that BRICS countries have a political problem. So, I would say that there are some cracks appearing in the BRICS. So on the one hand, you have China, which is definitely a socialist system. And what's more, it's far and ahead of all the other BRICS countries. Yeah, it's miles ahead of them. Russia has been forced into a more progressive position. I mean, Putin is not, in the past, I would have criticized Putin for being more neoliberal than he should be. Now, of course, he's been forced to shed some of that neoliberalism, if not all of it. So that's a good thing for Russia. It's a more developmental state. It's also been forced into more egalitarian policies. All good. I'm good with that. But in both Brazil and India, there are still the capitalist elites that remain in power are very much in power, though Brazil is still a step ahead of India in having the PT, which is a relatively organized force that is capable of taking state power. In India, we don't have such a force. At this point anyway. And the Modi government has been placed there by the corporate elites of India. And it has essentially been doing their bidding and engaging in a range of suppressive activities vis-a-vis any opposition, which is remarkable which is hardly noticed in the rest of the world. But, people are being killed in broad daylight for being activists and so on. To be a Muslim in India today, it must be like, it is like being a Jew in Germany after 1933, etc., etc. I mean, the situation is awful. And by the way, I'll put my cards on the table. I have compared the Modi government to fascism. So, and I don't think that the parallels are far-fetched at all. I would say, obviously, history never repeats itself, but it is definitely rhyming. So in this situation, then, yes, India, of course, even under the Modi government is forced to, is buying Russian oil and therefore annoying the Americans, and it has therefore incurred these things. But, there are two reasons why India buys Russian oil. Or let me start somewhere else. The Modi government, like the previous BJP government, would love to run into the arms of the Americans. But unfortunately, it is a mark of US decline that the US has very little to offer. And so, but nevertheless, the Indian corporate elite is much more closely aligned with the US and so on. Now, that's what they would like, but they can't have it. And increasingly, the whole incentive structure is changing. So obviously, if India were not getting cheap oil from Russia, the level of inflation in India would go through the roof. It's already bad enough. And for an extremely poor economy like India, where people earn money day by day and buy their necessities day by day, inflation is extremely problematic. Plus, Modi's crony capitalist friends are the ones who are benefiting by buying cheap Russian oil and then selling it, refining it, and selling it onwards at inflated prices. So they are making money hand over fist. That's why Modi has ended up annoying the Americans. Now, of course, China exerts an enormous economic gravity. It's not just that, India is importing a lot of things from China. Also, Indian business people are also importing machines from China, and they chafe under the restrictions that has been put into place by the Modi government's destruction of relationships with China. But now it is being forced to go back to China. I would say that the gravity being exerted by China will do its work. But the Indian corporate capitalist class and forces that Modi represents are not going to do it gracefully. They are going to go into the alliance with China, which is necessary, kicking and screaming. And who knows, there may be many reverses on the way, especially given that Trump can turn on a dime. And today he says that India is a failed economy. Tomorrow he will invite Modi back, and God knows what will happen. So, but I think the real issue is the issue of class power in all these countries, South Africa included. And I think that unless those tables are turned, so that's why a last point is that increasingly what we are seeing is not so much the alliance of the BRICS, which has, as you rightly say, many political problems, but what you are seeing is that China, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, these people, the alliance of the Sahelian states, these forces are now creating an alliance. And I think that, exactly how this will unfold is difficult to say, but I don't think, this alliance is made out of historical necessity. It is also, of course, based on ideological affinities of various sorts, and certainly an anti-imperialist ideological affinity. I was astonished to see, in my first visit to Russia after COVID, I attended a conference in which, prominent intellectuals like Professor Sergei Karaganov and Dmitry Trenin, they were sitting on the podium and saying, the era when Russia looked to the West is over. Imagine what that means. Peter the Great inaugurated this era of looking to the West, and now that is over. That's an astonishing historical turnaround. But I would say that more and more of the world will do that, because what's the point? At one point, America at least had some technology to give you. Today, it doesn't even have that. What does the world have to,
Yeah. Well, one thing about your analysis that I really like is, you called it geopolitical economy. My sense of this is because you wanted to bring the state and the nation back into the analysis, and not just this kind of abstract analysis of the dynamics of capitalism. And of course, Marx himself was very sensitive to the national question, also so that the class struggle doesn't just happen within a society, but it's also something that happens between nations. And I think it relates to this question of imperialism today, that, you have a lot of discourse on the left, including from some supposed Marxists, that China or Russia or even Iran are imperialist powers, which is nonsense. But, I kind of blame China for putting out this social imperialist term as a polemics in the 50s on the table in the 60s. But I think there's something very specific, and it has to do with people also turning away from empire, is that from the beginning, and there, I go back to the analysis of Gerald Horne, I think from the beginning, capitalism and imperialism was joined at the hip with this racist, supremacist mind virus. And it needs this to be imperialist. You said the countries developing today don't have the luxury where they can be imperialist, but they can't colonize. But partly is because this is kind of, particular ideological formation of Western Europeans to have this racism as part, consubstantial part of our psychologies. And we are supremacists without ever realizing it even. And that supremacism, in a sense, is also part of the contradictions that will bring what I call the white empire these days to its demise, because we collectively, the West, can't conceive that brown people are just as able to use technology, to advance it, to use all the collective knowledge of humanity to do something other than this genocidal, raping, plundering, exploiting project, which basically has been that. I know you said 200 years, I say 500, and Adnan says goes back to the Crusades. But this general project that there is this blood that is more pure and that has some kind of God-given right to dominate the world. And I think we need to keep this in mind, because that stops other countries from even conceiving of the form of imperialism that is this very specific genocidal. Aimé Césaire also talked about it, formation that is really West European at the end of the day, and then exported to the settler colonies. So I wanted to hear you a little bit about this. Are those countries imperialist? And do you see, as I do, that racism is just consubstantial to this, the dominant form of capitalism we've had up until now?
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a whole lot of very complex questions, and I think I can only answer very inadequately. But let me just respond by the thoughts that what you said, which is so interesting, gave rise to in my mind. So, firstly, of course, I agree that we need to have a very different we need to incorporate settler colonialism properly into our narrative of imperialism, because at one level, of course, but in a lot of writings, these words are also confused. When in the say, even in the 19th century, when people talked about colonialism, they actually meant settler colonialism, etc. Now, you see, many years ago, at the time of the 1992 Cairo Population Conference, Amartya Sen wrote an article which I found very interesting, and I used it for many years because I feel, when I teach a course on development, and I get very frustrated because you can teach an entire course and you can teach them about imperialism and development and, the need for state-directed development and blah, blah, and so on. And at the end of it, somebody or the other is bound to say, but isn't the problem population? Somebody or the other is bound to say that. So I just tear my hair out. So what I do now is, right at the beginning of the course, we deal with population. So then let's deal with and say population is not the problem. And one of the readings I used to use in this is Amartya Sen's article. And I also have some excellent other writings as well. But because demographers know what the story is, it's just that it doesn't quite trickle into popular understanding. But Amartya Sen points out that, what was settler colonialism? It was the export of Europe's surplus population to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. Yes. And by the way, other countries have to develop without the luxury of having settler colonialism as well. They don't have anywhere to export. Typically what you have is a situation where when industrialization begins, there's an enormous multiplication of the population. So, the population rises, and then at some level it stabilizes. And all of that has to be done without the safety valve of settler colonialism. And of course, settler colonialism also gave capitalism more territories that were, of course, seized from other peoples, from the indigenous peoples of other countries. But so that's one set of, so that, North America and Australia and New Zealand and blah, blah, South Africa became capitalist in similar ways. Okay. So that's one set of points. The second set of points that what you say gives rise to in my mind is that, sorry, I just missed that. You were talking, sorry, just completely, I should have written them down. They exported the extra surplus population. The third world cannot do that today. And what were the other things you were asking me about, Benji?
So I was pointing to how, to me, the racism is consubstantial to imperialism, and yes, also part of the reason why other countries are not imperialist. you don't just need to be capitalist to
Yes,
be
right.
imperialist. That's, very
Exactly. Yeah.
naive way
So
to look at
yeah,
things.
and again, yes, definitely, I think that racism has very much to do with imperialism. So because as I always say, like I'm sure that say the Chinese have various prejudicial attitudes towards the Vietnamese and vice versa, but that is not racism. It's born out of ignorance and it will
Exactly.
evaporate very quickly, but there is something very deep rooted, and as long as you have a structural power differential, then you will have these attitudes. So to me it comes out of the structures of imperialism, but they are declining. And I think more and more people in the world are getting used to the fact that the Chinese are ahead in technology. This is just a fact. And I think that the changes in material reality will change those circumstances further. I think that, the sort of work that you guys, I think Adnan, particularly you are doing, from what I understand, is very important, because you can't change the world without changing our understanding of history. I'm thinking, when you said Europeans can't can't think that brown people or black people can think or invent or whatever. But of course, there's Martin Bernal's famous book Black Athena. All the all the wonderful cultural attributes and scientific achievements of Greece, which are attributed to Greece, are actually of much wider provenance, and that they may have come to Europeans via Greece, but they came to Greece via somewhere else. I mean, as I often like to say, try landing a rocket on the moon or rocket anywhere with Roman numerals. You needed to have the Indo-Arabic form of numerals in order to get where we are today, etc. So anyway, so the I think that whole history will need to be rewritten if people are, and I think that this is beginning to happen, but I think that it's not, it needs to happen much more. I think we need to move away from this, and finally, I mean, I think that the racism of the West today is now coming back to bite it, because what you see is that the Western economies desperately need immigration, but they are going to be prevented from having the requisite amount of immigration by racism. This is going to be, like, be careful what you wish for, sort of thing.
Yes, I mean, I think one thing going forward that we'll all have to be paying attention to is what are some of the morbidities, you might say, of this decline, and the way that they manifest themselves in accelerating the process, but also making it more destructive, violent, chaotic. I mean, this is
Yes.
really, I think, what we're witnessing and what we have to be concerned about. And of course, the genocide in Gaza and the direction it has taken is, of course, perhaps emblematic of the way in which the colonial, racist, imperialist system and ideology prevents actively seems to be preventing the possibilities for change and different outcomes and rebalancing in the world in a way that's actually more productive and more healthy, more sustainable. Instead, we're facing these, viral, more, not to, you've talked about the virus, but these other viruses, are out there and are making the pathway towards a different world so much more unstable, unpredictable, and chaotic and violent. That's the challenge. Yeah.
I just remembered the point that it's a very important point. So I'm just going to make it. I think you're winding down, but I'll make this one point. So you were talking earlier about genocidal imperialism. And of course, there have been horrific instances of imperialist genocide around the world. But ultimately, I think that the purpose of imperialism is not genocide. It is to make the subordinated people work. That was the whole purpose of creating concentration camps in Germany as well. What was written on the entrance to Auschwitz? I haven't been there, but Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. You are supposed to work, and so the point was to work these people. Of course, they were under terrible conditions. They had no rights, so they were worked, often to death, etc. But they were worked. The genocide began when things began to go wrong. I think this comes out very clearly in Arno Meyer's book, Why Did the Heavens Not Darken?
in a certain sense, if you think about it, something similar is happening in Israel, Palestine, or Palestine, Israel. Because ideally, what would the Israelis would have wanted is that the Palestinians would meekly work for them for nothing for a long time, etc., build an economy with a racial segregation and so on. But of course, the Palestinians' urge for freedom has been irrepressible. They have fought tooth and nail for their rights. And so the project of domination having gone awry, it has turned genocidal. And that's where you see the genocide. And yes, of course, in that sense, imperialism has been genocidal. And indeed, people have said about, what was shocking. I think Mrs. Zaire says that somewhere, that what was shocking about the Holocaust and the genocide during the Second World War was that practices that were hitherto reserved for the colonies were brought to Europe. So, yeah.
Yes, he says it in here, Discourse on Colonialism.
Yeah, that's we
Page
should be
5 of
required
6, very early,
reading in
wonderful
every.
passage, yes, about that. And so, that gives us a deeper sense of the interpenetration between these ideologies of racism and how they work in a geopolitical and economic system of domination. Benji, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I have a question for Radhika, on the geopolitical level and what's coming up. What are the perspectives going forward? I've used this metaphor. I borrowed it from somebody, that it's the decline of the empire. It was used for the Zionist colony, but it's about boiling the frog. And I think it's a very good metaphor in a way, and I've kind of added my psychological bent to it by saying it's about boiling a psychopathic frog. Like in a way, you have this very narcissistic ideology. I think the elites have become also narcissistic, emotionally very stunted, like you're almost dealing with a bunch of 5-year-olds with nuclear weapons, right? And so if you're the adults in the room, which I believe you have an extremely meritocratic society, for example, in China, in other countries, possibly in Iran, in Russia, it's more, complicated. But your mission, and clearly they've accepted it, is how to boil that psychopathic frog without it jumping everybody into the nuclear fire. So how do you see that? Because, part of me is like, why don't they do more to stop the genocide? Why are they not doing something? Another part of me goes, well, this is so existential to the empire that if you do anything, if you turn the heat up too much, then it might go catastrophic. So how do you think those things?
Well, I agree with you. I have been haunted by the same question. Exactly. What's the point? What's the point of having all these nuclear weapons if China or Russia can't do anything? And I think that the reason is simple. It's that if they did something, that it would create a greater conflagration, that more people would die and so on. So I think that's the only reason I can think of. And I think that your image of this psychopathic frog, I mean, I'd love to think, I like thinking of Trump as a psychopathic frog. I think it fits him to a T. And so, I would say that, one of the things I've been saying about Trump, actually, much as he is indeed an extremely despicable character himself as a person. I mean, he's a misogynist, racist, all those things. I mean, he's an ugly cocktail of things. But on top of that, and I think it is a mark of the sickness of the United States, of US political economy, that somebody like him must be elected. And that therefore he is a symptom of a much deeper malaise. So that repulsive as he is, it is far more important to look at what it takes, what has to happen before a country elects such a leader. So, and I just want to say one final other thing, which is that, I really would like to advise people not to use the term geopolitics for two reasons. Number one, you really can never separate politics from economics. it doesn't make sense. But also, in historically, the term geopolitics is the province of people like Halford Mackinder, Alfred Mann. In Germany, I think you had a guy called Klaus Haushofer. These are imperialist thinkers who were part of the bourgeois tradition of separating politics from economics, from sociology, etc., etc. And then they came up with this term. That's why I use the term geopolitical economy, because that is the tradition of Smith or Ricardo, which then Marx brings to a culmination by essentially filling its gaps, essentially solving the problems they left unsolved.
Yes, I think the only problem with your far better term in reminding us that these are interrelated, geopolitical economy, is that it's hard to turn it into an adjective. Geopolitical economic. You have to really. I think you're absolutely right that it's a product of a certain kind of approach of thinking that abstracts politics in an imperial frame from the economic, conditions and materiality. So it's very helpful. And of course, that's only possible to really understand by characterizing it and studying it and examining it historically, as you've been doing in your work. And today, we really appreciate so much your generosity with your time and with your, intellectual analysis. And I think our audience, I can speak for them. I can certainly speak for myself and possibly for Benji in saying that we've learned a lot and it's been very stimulating and interesting. And I hope in the future we can have you come back on to elaborate other dimensions of this. We even had a very interesting question that came in right at the end. So we will take it now, but about, what comes first, capitalism or imperialism? And of course, this is a very interesting kind of question. So perhaps we'll have a future conversation if you've enjoyed it, even a small amount compared to how much we have. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. And of course, I would love to come back. It's been a wonderful conversation for me too.
That's great.
Wonderful. Let's consider it. You will come back then. Thank you so much, Radhika. What a wonderful
Thank you very much.
Conversation.
People in the audience are lauding and saying that they've been following you and Michael Hudson on Geopolitical Economy Report. So I do want to say, in addition to radhikadesai.com, people should check out your podcasts and videos.
Oh, yeah.
On the subject, and of course follow you because you are a guest on not just this show but many others where you've had great discussions as well. And I just want to remind listeners and watchers, if you could like the stream, share it with friends so that more people get a chance to hear these interesting discussions, and subscribe to both the Resistance is Fertile channel and the Adnan Husain Show. Much more coming up soon. Until next time, peace and justice,
free Palestine,
and free
Palestine.
Free Palestine, indeed. Thank you.
Outstanding.
Bye-bye.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.